Hey there, and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be talking about the wedding lenses that I use and give you a little bit of insight in my workflow and the history of the lenses and how my style has changed. There's no right or wrong way of doing this, and it just depends on the style and what you're trying to achieve. When I started out wedding photography, I used a 50mm lens for pretty much everything. It was the Canon 1.4 and I loved it. After that, I got the Canon 135mm lens. I really fell in love with this lens because it excelled in portraits. One of the drawbacks of using the 50mm and the 135mm is the fact that it wasn't very good at capturing the context. It was very good at isolating the subjects and they just excelled in the portraiture part, but unfortunately they didn't excel in kind of getting the bigger picture. The 135mm lens had a really shallow depth of field and a really beautiful bokeh, but I found contradictory to what people look for, that it was a little bit too much bokeh for me. All the photos looked very similar to each other. As my style has changed, I've been looking for lenses that opened up the field. When I photographed people, I can also photograph the context and the surroundings. Very popular choice in wedding photography is either 50mm 135mm combination or the 35mm 85mm combination. So that's what I'm using right now. I'm using a 35mm 85mm combination. With the 35mm, I'm using this Tamron 35mm 1.4 lens on my camera all the time. So I have two cameras when I photograph. My main camera, which has a 35mm lens on it the whole time, and my secondary camera, in which I swap out different lenses depending on what I am trying to do. So the 135mm lens stays on with me throughout the day, from the preparation photos all the way to the ceremony, to the reception photos. And this is my go-to lens for everything from detail shots, family photos, portraits, and taking pictures of people dancing. Another lens that I use quite extensively is the 28mm. That lens is what I'm using right now to record this video, but I use the 28mm just to get a wider range and just to open up when I take photos of people. It really puts into context the surroundings and it just gives a little bit more of the story. So I consider myself a documentary wedding photographer. What that means is that I don't focus only on isolating people and creating beautiful portraits, but I focus on documenting the wedding and getting the surroundings, putting things into context as well. The 28mm I'll normally use when I show up for preparation photos because the spaces that I photograph in can get really tight, and that lens allows me to just bump up against the wall and I still capture everything in my frame of view. I also use the 28mm for family photos. Sometimes there are a lot of people in a family photo and I need to get a little bit wider. I also like using the 28mm during reception, especially for the dancing photos where I can back up a little bit and get a little bit more of the action and what's going on. Okay, another lens that I love using is the 85mm lens. So this is what I use when I want to isolate my subject or get a little bit closer. This lens I use extensively for portraits, just create some very beautiful portraits. And I'll also use it during the ceremony. I'll use the 85mm just to close that distance in between. Other than that, I don't really use the 85mm for much more. So it's very specific to portraits and ceremony photos. Sometimes I'll use it during reception for speeches as well if I need to get a little bit closer depending on how everything is set up. But that's the 85mm lens, and this is a Canon 85mm. Let me see the aperture. I think this is a 1.8. Alright, one of my favorite lenses that I like using is this Canon tilt shift 24mm lens. I actually use this lens quite a bit to get any cool detail shots or any creative shots. I'll use this lens throughout the day, including preparation photos if I want to take some really nice detail shots of the bouquet or the wedding dress, the rings, etc. This lens gives me a lot of flexibility over what I decide to keep in focus. Something else that I really enjoy using this lens for is portraits. I have achieved some really creative and really amazing photos using this lens, and it almost puts a little bit of motion into the photos. It's difficult to explain, and through that motion it adds emotion as well. And I think the photos are very unique and very powerful. And like I said, I've been using this lens quite a bit. During the ceremony, maybe I'll get like a really wide shot of everything. And then during reception, I really enjoy using this lens to get photos of the space because I have control over what I want to keep in focus. So it really makes the rooms look bigger, and it just doesn't make the photo look as dull because this lens is a little bit more creative. All right, so that's a little bit of an insight in the lenses that I use for my wedding photography. Like I said, over the years, I went from isolating people and isolating the subject to wanting to document things and putting a lot more context in my photos. This is why I've decided to go to a 35-85 combo rather than a 50-135 combo, and I've gotten the lenses to complement that style. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'm going to be putting up more in-depth video of each of the lens and how I use it, the pros and cons of what I like about it, and just give you a little bit more information. Until next time, see ya.